Hello and welcome to Class 4 of the Library of Congress classification class. Uh, for this final week, we will continue our weekly discussion and we will continue to work with the schedules and tables, and you will need to finish up all work by the last day of class. So make sure to watch for announcements as we go forward in terms of exactly when all the work needs to be done. In this class, we are going to talk about some of the exceptions and some of the sort of unique parts of classification. And hopefully, as we discuss some of these situations and talk about how they fit together, it will begin to really kind of sink in and kind of click together in terms of how Library of Congress classification works. So we're going to talk about Cuttering a little bit, sort of review what we've talked about so far with Cuttering, and then we're really going to dive into those special situations. For these exercises, you will use several tools. So you will use some of the tools we've already used before. So make sure to pay attention to any instructions that are given to you for the exercises, because those instructions will tell you which tool to use, and make sure to use the right tool so that you'll end up at the same place that we do. As a reminder, when you are working with ClassWeb, please make sure to log out as soon as you're done with it. So don't leave it open. Don't just close your browser and think that that is going to close everything down. Make sure to actually log out. Just as a couple of reminders and sort of to review some of the things we've talked about thus far, unless you work for the Library of Congress, the call number you input into a marked bibliographic record will be formatted as an 050 second indicator 4, and that says that's an LC formatted call number input by a member institution. So that means it's input by any of us following the Library of Congress classification rules and guidelines, which is what we're doing. And in that, the subfield A, that is where our class goes. And if you have a first cutter that's been given to you, or if the schedules and tables have guided you through the process of building a class with that first cutter, that's going to go in your subfield A. The subfield B is where the cutter goes that we are creating. And then, of course, our date goes in the last part of that. So today we'll also talk about dates and how that fits together too. If you have two cutters, just an example of what two cutters looks like. If you have two cutters, of course, this is a member input call number. So this is a call number not input by the Library of Congress staff or catalogers. It's input by one of us. And so second indicator 4. And then we have our cutter there. Our class with that first cutter is in that first part in that subfield A. And as I mentioned earlier, the subfield A's are sometimes hidden or do not appear in various software. So some ILSs will conceal or hide the subfield A. OCLC conceals and hides the subfield A. So that's why you don't see a subfield A in any of these fields. They start with something else. In some cases, starts with a B or a C. The subfield B in the call number, that is our last cutter. That's the cutter that we input typically when we are cataloging. So if you're doing original cataloging, you would be guided through that process of coming up with the class in that first cutter, or you might just be given that class and first cutter, as we saw from our author numbers. So the author number is the class and the first cutter. So we're given that information, and then we're going to cutter following specific rules then. And then, of course, our date. If we just have one cutter, so there is no cutter that has been given to us, or we have not been directed to create a cutter through the tables. So we've been given no information, no instructions to do anything else, and our subject corresponds to just that sort of main class. And so we just take that information and then we will do our cutter. And we do that, the B goes between the cutter and then that class. So one cutter or two, I think you should have a good sense of this by now, that LCC is going to tell you, the classification tables are going to tell you, the schedule is going to direct you to those tables. It may just tell you. If you are looking for a literary author, they are typically, not always, but typically going to have a author number, which would be that class and their cutter, and you are just going to use that information. So when you are cuttering for an author number, you're going to use the information that is given to you. Of course, Class Web or the Library of Congress classification and the free versions, those will all direct you to that process. You should be familiar, be able to find these pretty easily by now. Maybe you've already bookmarked them, the Library of Congress classification outline. This is not going to give you complete information, but it is a good outline. And if you actually do the PDF version, then the PDF version will actually direct you to the tables and things like that. So this is the outline, and then there's also that PDF version that will give you actually the tables and things like that. So find the base call number for your subject. That is the first subject heading that's listed in your record. And then the cutter would be assigned by the call number. If you're copy cataloging, you will already see this information in the record, but what you may need to do is check and review it, especially as we talk about some of the scenarios and situations today, because some of these get missed all the time. So knowing what to look for is going to help you in terms of making sure that the materials and resources you have in your collection sit together as they should on the shelf. So what to cutter? For nonfiction, and this is what a lot of us think about when we're cuttering. We just think like, oh, we just cutter by main entry. That's going to be whatever's in that, maybe the 100 field or 110 or 111. We're just going to cutter by that. And that's true for most nonfiction. There are some situations, and we're going to talk about some of those in just a few minutes, but pretty much that's a pretty good rule of thumb in terms of what you should cut it for. Nonfiction, typically that's going to be main entry. For works of literature, as we saw from last week, you're going to cutter by the title because the author name has already been cuttered or classed in that base call number. And so if you look in the authority file and you find that author number will include a classification for that author. So you don't need to do the author twice. You've already done it there. So then you're going to cutter by that author's, the title of the work. And so that means when you look at those materials, and as I mentioned last week, Shakespeare is a great example to go look at on shelves because there's usually so much of it, even in a smaller library, you'll have quite a bit of Shakespeare, that when you look at Shakespeare, you'll see that the criticisms sit together, the criticisms of Hamlet, if you're a big enough library to where you actually have criticisms of specific works, the criticism of Hamlet will sit next to Hamlet. And so you can kind of see how that work actually lays out a little bit. For works about works of literature, that would be like a criticism of Hamlet. You're going to use that base call number for the specific work if it has its own call number, and then you're going to use your table. In other words, you're going to keep the Hamlet criticisms together on the shelf next to Hamlet. So you're not going to put all the Shakespeare criticisms at the end regardless what title they're about. You're going to actually put them near the work if the work has its own call number set up for it. Now, if you have an author who only has one author call number, then, in that case, you're just going to put the criticisms, probably depending on what it is, you may just put them all together at the end. This is where it gets to a little bit of that finesse, like exactly where do you put it on the shelf. Artwork is also similar, and we didn't talk much about artwork in this class about artists, but artists are very similar in terms of how they're handled in terms of how their resources and materials are classed. So author exhibits are by the year, and they are you know, organized under that artist name, and that artist name is under what type of work they do. Are they a painter? Are they a sculptor? That kind of thing. So we're not going to talk too much about artists, but I did want to mention that artists are a little bit similar. So they're a little bit of a unique category too. Of course, where to look for authorities. You can look lots of different places. We looked at OCLC last week, but you can also look in the Library of Congress authorities. You do want to make sure that when you're searching for names that you actually choose name authority headings. If you want to search for those subject headings, that would be subject authority headings. And if you want to search for titles, and that might be like Hamlet or Huckleberry Finn or something like that, then you are going to search for that title authority heading. And then we're going to talk a tiny little bit about series authorities at the end, just very, very briefly. Can't go into it too much. But if you were going to look for series authority headings, you would also look under title for those. You can also choose keyword authorities all. That may give you too much to sort through. That may just give you so much you can't find what you're looking for. But if you're really not sure exactly which kind of authority you're searching for, you can try the keywords all. So by now you should be able to look at call numbers and get a sense of like how that number was constructed. For authors, you can actually kind of reverse engineer these. And in fact, this is a good example of sort of reverse engineering, and this is a good exercise to kind of take with you as you go forward in terms of looking at call numbers or cataloging. If you're not cataloging and you want to keep your skills sharp, just go into your catalog and find some call numbers, and then look through the classification tables. You can use the PDF classification tables if you don't have access to ClassWeb, and just sort of do this process and reverse engineer it. Look at the PS. What is PS? PS is American literature. All right, so let me look in the American literature section. Let me look in PS. So I'm going to look, and then I find 3543, and that's for individual authors 1900 to 1960, beginning with the letter V. So that's exactly where Gore Vidal would be, right? So, you can kind of deconstruct these and sort of do some reverse engineering, and that will help keep your skills sharp. And you may even find some things that you have questions about. But it's a good exercise in terms of looking at it. So you'll be looking at what your first subject heading is, and then looking at that correlation with that, and also taking with you some of these situations that are a little bit different. So literature is a little bit different. Art's a little bit different, and then we're about to look at some other examples. So the PS 3543.I26, that is actually determined by where Gore Vidal would fit into the Library of Congress classification. So where would he fit in? Well, he's going to fit American literature, individual authors, beginning with, for 1900 to 1960, beginning with V. And then we're going to give him an author cutter of Vidal. Now, because that class number there actually covers the V, so it actually covers the first initial, the first letter of his last name, then the author cutter actually starts with I, because we've already covered the V in that. Sometimes it will work this way when you look at the Library of Congress classification numbers for authors. Sometimes it works that way and sometimes it doesn't. It really depends upon what that number encompasses in terms of whether or not you start with the author's first letter of their last name, or if you start with the second letter because you've already got that first letter covered. So it really depends upon how that part of the classification schedule is set up. So when you look at author numbers and authority records, you should be able to pretty easily see like how that author number is constructed by kind of doing this reverse engineering process. Then of course the next part of it would be what we would assign. So we would figure out, probably most easiest way for a work of literature is to look in the authority file and find the author's number. So the author's number is PS 3543 .I26 or decimal I26. So that would be the author number. So that would be what we start with. And then we would cut her by the title, or what some people call the book number. So the book number is where we're going to cut her for the title. In this case, we would cut her for Hollywood. So we're going to go ahead and go out 2 digits. If you have a whole bunch of stuff by one author and they just keep writing titles that are so similar, Hollywood, Hollyweird, Hollywood Tales of Horror, whatever it may be, they're writing so close together, the titles are almost the same, then you may want to go out 1 more digit to keep those titles separate, and so you don't create call number conflicts. And then finally, the date of publication. So another example, this is writing about a biography, a criticism about Gore Vidal. So it's not going to be under Gore Vidal as a book number because it's not a book that he wrote. This is something about him. So that's where you get that P to PZ40 table. So that's where you get that table that you're going to consult to. So if it were a book that was written by him, that was a work of fiction, we would follow the PS 3543 point I26, and then we would cut her by whatever the title was, and then we'd add her date. If this is a book about him, or a book that is about one of his works, then we would want to give it a cutter so that it would sit near those things but not be part of it. So when we have sort of general criticism, general biographies of authors, we usually put those, that's in that Z category. So they'll sit kind of together there at the end. So things you have to figure out: is this a work of fiction or nonfiction? I mean, that's sort of the big first thing, right? And look at your subject headings and your genre headings. That will help you. If it is literature related, is it a work of literature itself, or is it something else like a biography, a criticism, a collection? I've given you some of the sections of the shelf listing manual that will be of use in terms of looking at them. One thing to pay attention to is that you can have non-literary works by literary authors, and we see this a lot of times. Stephen King creates a writes a book about how to write a novel. There's just all kinds of examples. I mean, that's a very common thing where writers, write about how to write a novel, or how to be a good editor, or how to get good ideas, or find inspiration, or whatever it may be. There's a lot of that kind of how-to manual kinds of things. So if it's a non-literary work, then it's going to fall into where that topic would be. So if it's something that's generally writing oriented, it's not going to be classed with that literary author. Now, if it's that literary author's kind of like memoirs and like things that they've written sort of more about themselves versus kind of the process, or like a general how-to guide, then that would fall into that category of being more something they're writing for themselves, like a biography or memoirs or letters or things like that. So about dates, what happens when you have no dates? Can you have no dates in a call number, or 2 dates in a call number? Practice is these days to use dates in call numbers, and there are some exceptions: serials, analytics, special collections, and older works. And by older works, I mean things that were cataloged a long time ago. Dates were not consistently used in call numbers really up until the early 1990s. So there's a lot more variety in terms of those older records. There are also some classes, and we're going to look at examples of these in just a second, that subarrange by year or event. If you have instructions that whatever you are, whatever subject you're in, the classification schedules, if you have instructions that you should subarrange by year or an event, then you need to do that. And we're going to look at examples of that. So follow your instructions. Follow what LC tells you to do. Events are one category where you will often have instructions to use the date. And when you use a date, basically it means that within the call number itself, you are going to put the date that is associated with that event. You're only going to do this if you're instructed to. So for example, US presidential elections. By default, they include the date of the election and then are further subarranged by main entry. So main entry, that is our 100, 110, 111 field. So presidential elections, JK 526, year 2000, and sorry, that was one of my examples, year 2000, and then our main entry is Dover, so that would be D68. Now, in terms of where you're going to put that subfield B to break that up, the subfield B will go before that last cutter. I know this looks really weird to see it this way. And then, of course, we have our date of publication at the end. So if you are instructed, U.S. presidential elections, I know we got one coming up shortly, U.S. presidential elections include the date of the election. That's just part of it. So once you find, whenever you do elections, once you find whatever kind of election, it may be local, state, presidential elections, once you find your class, it's going to give you instructions that you need to include the date of the election. And then once you do that part of it, then you're going to then cutter for your main entry. Olympics, we've got those coming up again too. Shelf list events with a date within the call number, again, if instructed to do so. Olympics will give you that instructions. So for example, in the classification schedule, it'll say Olympic Games, Modern Revivals, and then it's going to give you your call number, GV722. And then individual contest by year. So it's telling you exactly what to do. GV722 by year. So that's the next piece you're going to put in. And then you're going to subarrange by author. So that means you're going to then cutter by your author, which would be your main entry. So GV722, that covers this first part of it, individual contest, Olympic Games. By year, you're going to add in the by year, and then you're going to put in your author. And there's our subfield B showing us that it's going to be before that cutter there. We do not do another cutter here. So this year does serve as the sort of placeholder or position of what we would do for a cutter for events. So like I said, events are something that when you have something that comes across your desk, and I know we've got the Olympics coming up, we've got elections coming up, those are two big things where depending on what your library, what kind of library you are, what you're collecting, you may see these materials come across your desk. If you're copy cataloging something that comes across your desk for the Olympics and the call number that comes across does not have the date of the Olympics in there, then you need to take a look at it and very carefully look at the record, look at your subject headings and see if there's a subject heading for a specific Olympic event. So if it says, 1984 Winter Olympics, then that would be something that would give me the clue that it needs to have that date, 1984, in there. Or it may have the number Olympics. You know, it may say 20th Winter Olympics, and then you might have to go look up the date to see when the 20th Olympics were, 20th Winter Olympics were. But if it has that information about a specific Olympics, then it should have the year in there. If you have something that says the history of Olympics and it's like covering lots of different Olympics, you're not going to have a date. It's just for that event related kind of stuff. So if you have something that's like about the Olympics in general, or maybe even even a particular, you know, it could be, you know, the marathon in the Olympics, but it's not a particular Olympics. It's just sort of in general, you know, running in the Olympics, surfing. They've been talking about having surfing in the Olympics, you know, so it could be like that kind of thing. And it's just about like a particular type of competition. That's not going to have a date. If it were about, you know, whatever Olympics had skateboarding as a exhibition sport, then if depending upon what your subject headings were, if it were for that particular Olympics event, then you would have a date. Here's an example of what we would see with elections. So financing the 2016 election. A lot of times when you see these election sort of things, you'll see elections just kind of dates all over the place, you know, be in the title. You'll see dates elsewhere in your subject headings. You'll just see dates lots of different places. But this is what it looks like when you have that kind of date. So if you're copy cataloging and you see something that looks like this, with this JK 1968 and then 2016, and then your subfield B, and then since we don't have a 100 field here, we're going to cutter by financing. So there's no main entry here. There's no 100, 110, 111. So we're just going to cutter by the title for that. You know, this is correct, and that's how it should look. Disasters, you know, think these are all event-oriented things. So if there is a heading, so you need to have a subject heading for the disaster. So if you have a subject heading for a specific disaster, again, it has to be, think about time, you know, it could be a yearly thing, you know, like a thing that's going to happen at a particular time of the year, like the elections. It could be something that just, you know, shows up, and we're going to look at an example, but Katrina is an example, right? Certainly not anything that's planned, but events don't have to be planned or unplanned. There's nothing about the planning aspect of it that matters in terms of how we catalog it. It's whether or not it is a specific singular event, and we are putting those subject headings in there for that specific singular event. If so, then our call number will have the date for that specific event. So, you know, class numbers for disaster relief, earthquakes, hurricanes, etc., include the date of the event and then are further sub-arranged by locality and main entry. So for disasters, because not only do they happen at a particular time, and we only in cataloging look at the year, so we don't get down to the date and the time of the day and all that kind of stuff, so we're only year focused. But then we also look at where it happened. So we do both of those kinds of things. So we have something about Hurricane Katrina relief that happened in the Gulf Coast. And so our HV 636 is tied to that, you know, category of disasters, hurricanes. Katrina happened in 2005. This is related to the Gulf Coast. So we have that cutter, that geographic cutter for Gulf Coast. So that's getting to our locality and main entry. So when you see that it gives you in your instructions two things, actually it gives you three things. The date, so it tells you first the date, and are further subarranged, and it's given you locality and main entry. So that is actually going to give you you're going to have 2 cutters. And when you have this situation, your subfield B is actually going to go before that O. So here in our classification schedule, here's earthquakes, HV 600 by date of occurrence. Subarranged by place, so first by date, it tells you first, HV 600, that's your earthquakes. You're going to do it by date of occurrence because it's an event happening at a specific place and time. Now, if this is about earthquakes in general, the history of earthquakes of the world, it is not going to follow this pattern. So you'll be looking in a different category related to earthquakes for that. But you're just looking for like general history of earthquakes. That is not going to be the category you're looking for. That is not the category you're looking for. But we're looking for earthquakes as an event and occurrence. So by date first, and then by place, and then by author. So it tells us exactly what to do. HV 600, that's what you're going to do for earthquakes. And then you're going to arrange by date of occurrence. So what year did it occur? And you should have all this information right there in front of you. When did it occur? And then by place, where did it occur? A to Z, cutter A to Z. And then by author, that would be your main entry. If you do not have a main entry, then you would do by title. So an example in the shelf list, we have HV 600 2001. This earthquake happened in 2001. And then we cutter by our place, which started with an E, and then by our author, which started with a U. I think I've stressed this one pretty well. This is a book about supply and demand after Hurricane Maria, but it is not specifically about Hurricane Maria itself. It's more emergency, and you can see our subject headings here. Emergency management and crisis management got cut off, but our subject headings are emergency management, crisis management. So it's not about the event of Hurricane Maria. It's more about some other things that kind of happened around it. So since it's not about the event itself, we don't have any subject headings for Hurricane Maria, and our subject heading up there does not follow the pattern of an event subject heading for Hurricane Maria. Now, you may get this book that comes across your desk and you may look at it a little bit more and you may say, well, this is all about Hurricane Maria. It's just about like emergency management during Hurricane Maria. And that would be fine to catalog it that way, but the person who cataloged this did not see it being about Hurricane Maria specifically, but more about emergency management and stuff like that. Now this one is about Hurricane Maria. This is voices, so it's stories from Hurricane Maria. So it is about Hurricane Maria. And we can see here, there's our 2017, and it's cuttered for Puerto Rico. And then it's cuttered for, the cutter we've given it would be for voices because we don't have a 100 fill. So this one is about Hurricane Maria. Other events that are similar in terms of kind of how events happen, conferences. Conferences have a little bit more specific rules in terms of when you cutter for a conference and when you don't. But if there is a 111 for a conference or congress and a date appears in that field, then use that date. So use the date that's in the 111 for your call number. If the year is not present in that 100 field of your MARC record, then you're just going to use the publication date. And there's an example here where we have this 111. You see here we have 1981 in the date. And so even though our date of publication is 1982, in the call number, we're going to use 1981. I don't really know the reasoning for why you do it one time and not the other, except because it has to do with how that corporate, that conference, that corporate body is set up. Here's another example of that. And this is a real example, so you can actually go look at it if you want to. We have 2017. We've put that in our call number. And you see here in our 111 field, we have 2017. But then when you look at the date of publication, it was actually published in 2019. Now, as a copy cataloger, this is something you will see wrong quite a bit. You will see, 2017 over here and 2019 here, and you'll know from looking at your 111 with that date in it, you will know that the call number should be 2017, and yet it will not be. It'll be 2019. Photocopies and reprints, etc. These are another category of material that sit near next to the original work. They use the same call number as the original work, and they use the date of publication of that original work. And all we do to kind of let somebody know, there's other places in the record while we kind of give people a tip that it's a reproduction, but in terms of the call number, the only thing we do is add an A to the end of it. And this is considered to be a work letter when you add a letter to the end of the date. So for example, in our original, we have PS 3546.I331982. That's the original, and then we're just going to add an A to the photocopy. Here's an example one. One of the things you may want to do is actually go in, you can search in the Library of Congress catalog and search for this by title, or you can search in OCLC and search by number, but this is an interesting one to actually go in and look at it because you can see the other things that are different. There will be typically for these reproductions, facsimiles, there'll be a linking fields down in the 775s. Down at the bottom of the record, I didn't capture all of that, but a couple of things you can see here. We have 1872A, so that tells us it's a reproduction of something from 1872. This is the call number of the original. If you go look the original up, here's the information of when it was originally published. Now we would see this as a 264 versus a 260, but the rest of the records is good. And then we have a 533 here, and now this tells us all about the photocopying of it. So this was photocopied by UMI Books on Demand in 2001, and they even put in the size because sometimes the size are different. The pagination should be the same from the original because remember, this is a reproduction of the original. If you have something that says it's a reprint or reproduction, but the paging is different, then that's a tip that you have a different edition and you need to take a look at it carefully. A reproduction is truly a reproduction. It's just like you put that book down or whatever it may be, book, pamphlet, whatever it is, you put it down on the copier and you literally made a copy of it. That's what it should be like. And if it's like that, that means the paging should be the same. Now there may be a new title page that's put in the front that says, photocopy UMI Books on Demand 2001. That's very likely that there'll be sort of that front title page in front of the book itself. But the guts of the book, the book itself should be an exact reproduction. And if it's not, if it's got a bunch of other stuff adding into it, then you need to take a little bit more of a look at it. Editions, I've talked a little bit about editions already. Editions shelf list or sit next to the original work. They use the same call number, but then you use the dates to distinguish editions. So if you have an edition of a book that's published, one's published now, or one's published in 1982, then maybe one's published in 1985, and one's published in 1986, you're just going to use the dates as they are. You'll use the same call number, but you'll use the date of when it's printed. So for those of you who are copy cataloging, you get in something that says 2nd edition or 3rd edition or 9th edition or 52nd edition as they come in sometimes, then you should look in your catalog to see if you have any of the other editions. And if you do, see what that call number is, because you want your editions to sit next to each other, but just be distinguished by date. Now, if you have multiple editions in the same year, which sometimes happens, you know, an author or a publishing house will realize that something did not get printed properly, and so they'll just go ahead and rush out another edition. Sometimes it'll say reprinted with corrections. If you see reprinted with corrections, then you have a different edition, because that means there's content in there that is new and different. So reprinted with additions, reprinted with corrections, corrected edition, any of those kinds of things are tips that you have a different edition. They may be printed in the same year, and if they are, then you'll use a B, C, D, has many letters down as you need to go. But you're going to start with B. So you may see B. So if you're copy cataloging and you see a record that has a B in the call number, that means that whoever created that call number saw that there was a different edition of that same work in the same year, and so they've added a B to distinguish the two of them. Or it could be a C, a D, a E, it can go on and on and on. Translation numbers, the shelf listing practice is in G150, and these are used to separate the translation from the original work. They are added to the cutter number for the work. They use the range 12 to 18, but SLC has a wonderful list of translation cutters that are a very extended list. So they've done a lot of work to really deal with a lot of different languages. As a general rule, you're going to use the translation table when assigning a cutter table for a translation only if it meets both of these. When the entry is under personal author or title and the preferred title plus the language is provided. You're not going to use translation numbers for entries with a corporate or conference creator. So if you see conference in that 111, not going to use a translation number. For serials, not going to use it. Autobiographies or correspondence, not going to use it. And then the biography table, there's one area of an exception that you can use it. So just this is one of these areas to kind of just keep this one, keep this slide handy. And then when a caption includes the instructions by date, and we've already talked about by date quite a bit, unless a subarrangement is explicitly printed in the schedule. So basically you're going to follow the instructions for that one. Some examples, we have considerations on the government of Poland. That's the translated version from French. So we have here translated from the French, and then we have a 240. So that's one of the things you're looking for is a 240. And we have here our 13, and this is the call number for the original work, JN670 60, and then point R68 is the original work, and then the cutter for from French into English is 13. So if you are a library that gets a lot of translated works into English, then you're going to be using, you'll know the 13 because you'll use it a lot. So you'll see here we have the subfield L, and it tells us what language it's being translated into. So English. So that tells you what you're going to be looking for in that translation table. You're going to be looking for what is translated into English. Translated into English is 13, and you should have the 240. Here's another example. Here's an original. And DS135.P62J4439 2000, that was the original. And then we got a copy of it translated into English, and we're just going to add that 13 to that last cutter. It is always to the last cutter. Of course, if you only have one cutter, it is the beginning and end cutter, but you're going to add it to that last cutter. Here's one translating it into Dutch, and we're going to look at our table, and the SCL table is great because it lists all the languages, but the Library of Congress cutter table, there's a translation cutter table that's much more abbreviated. Dutch is 125. If there is no uniform title, and that's what that 240 is, the uniform title plus the language, we already looked at that, or the main entry is not a personal author or a title, you're not gonna, if you don't have any of that, then you're not going to use that translation number. If the schedule has the caption by language A to Z instead, then you're going to construct the cutter number based on the language itself. And that would be like English, which is E5. So you're going to follow your instructions. If your instruction tells you to do something with language, you'll follow that. If your instructions tell you nothing about language, then you're just, and you've got the 240, and with that information about what it's being translated into, then you're just going to add that last bit onto your last cutter. So that's all you're going to do. So these are pretty easy. I mean, you know, when you get something that says translated from Spanish, and then you look and there's a 240 and it has the title, and then it says English. So you're like, okay, so it's translated from Spanish into English. That's pretty easy to see. And then I'm actually can probably memorize that 13 is going to be what I'm going to add for things that are translated into English. And I'm just going to add 13 to the end of that. And so then what that will mean is if you have both of these, you would have the original, and then you would have the English language version sitting close to it. Might even be right next to it if you don't have any other languages that are in there. So we already talked about a little bit about these, but with or without translation numbers. If you have uniform title and language, add the translation number. If you have no uniform title, no 240, so uniform title is the 240, and the original title is not given, then you're going to add no translation number. And here's an example. We've already looked at one of, you know, adding the translation number. It's got a 130 there, so it may be a 130 or 240, depending on what you have there. 130 or 240, and we have there that subfield L English. So basically what you're looking for is a title. A title for the original title, and then what language it's being translated into. And you can see that in a 240 or 130. Down here we have carbon molecules and materials. It is translated from the French, but there is nothing in there that tells us what it's being translated into. Now we can guess it's carbon molecules and materials. We can guess it's probably being translated in English, but the rules say if you do not have a field that has that original title in it, 130, 240, that tells you what the language it's being translated into, that subfield L, then you are not going to add your translation number. So there are also some other exceptions. There are classes that are subarranged by date only. These are kind of strange little places within the classification schedule, and they are usually going to be things like selected works or collections or something like that. There'll be something that's kind of broad. So if you have something that says, when you're looking at it, classes subarranged by date only, that means you don't do anything else, you don't cutter, you don't do anything. It tells you date only. Then you're going to just do date only, and you're kind of like, what else do I do? It told me not to do anything else, right? Well, to keep yourself from having a call number conflict, then you're just going to add that B or C or D or E or F or however far you need to go. If you have a whole bunch of selected works of Alfred Tennyson, you know, you just collecting them up, and you've got a bunch of them, and they're all in the same year, then you know, you're just going to have to B, C, D, E it until you don't have any more conflicts. If they're different years, of course, you're going to use the year. But there are some categories, especially in works of literature, collections, selected works, things like that, where it says subarrange by date only. You follow your instructions. The Bible has a lot of very specific instructions to it as well. Just wanted to mention a couple of things about it. If you see in the classification schedule, this is the King James Authorized Version, the 1611, and the call number is BS 185. That's that base call number, and then it says by date, and then subarranged by place of publication. So it's telling us two instructions. We're going to first arrange by date, and then we're going to arrange by place of publication. In this case, our Bible was printed in 1985, or sorry, 1984. So we're going to add 1984, and then we're going to subarrange by the place of publication. Another example, this is an authorized version. It was published in Chicago in 1976. So we have our call number BS 2085, published in the year 1976, and then published in Chicago. And it tells us to organize them that way. By date, then subarrange by place. So, class numbers for regimental histories. Usually, not always, this one gets missed a lot too, include the number of the unit. So D769.3, 101 ones, and then we actually cutter it. So here we have, this one is, I've given you the OCLC number there so you can take a look at it. This one we have E 515.5 10th, and then E44 2012. So date of publication is 2012. Our main entry is Eggleston, so that's where our E44 comes from. For this particular group, where they would fall into the classification table is E515.5, and then we are going to give them their regiment number, which is 10th. Now, you're only going to do this if you see a subject heading that includes a regiment number. So you need to have some sort of documentation for that. You may never see any of these, or I worked on a lot of military history a couple of years ago, and I saw quite a few of these. So multi-part things, kind of as we wrap up here. Multi-part things are things like serials, monographs that are part of something else. They could be a part of a set, an analytic. Loose leaf publications, these are often legal materials that update, which means you'll get like a packet in the mail and it'll tell you like, remove these pages and replace them. Or it may just tell you, put these all in a binder, or pull these supplements and replace them. And you'll see interesting notes on these, sometimes in holdings records and sometimes in the bibliographic record, and it'll say things like, kept up to date with supplements in pocket, or you know, it may not say anything if it's something where you just enter file pages. But these are a little bit, I'd say a little bit fun, because you're never quite sure exactly. They all seem to work a little bit differently. So you follow the instructions from the publisher in terms of how you replace these. But they do update. And of course, serials are continuing, so they just continue on. So basically anything that updates, and websites fall into this category too, we do not give them a date typically. So things that we do not just sort of out of the box generally give dates to, serials loosely for publications, and really anything that updates, and websites would fall into this category too. If you do catalog websites. Monosets, so monographic sets of books. Monographic multi-parts will often include the date, but serials will rarely include a date in the call number. And when you have a monograph that is part of a set, the date comes from the year of the first volume's publication. I once cataloged a set, and I cataloged, I think it was volume 9, and there had been a 100-year gap in publication. So what I was cataloging was from the 1980s, and the first volume had been cataloged over a year, cataloged and published over 100 years earlier. Thank goodness the record had lots of notes to help me make sense of it and see that it did indeed fit there, but that was not an easy thing to figure out. You do have monographs sometimes that are part of a larger title, and this can be a larger serial title or it can be a larger monographic title. And that's what we call an analytic, when you have something that is part of a bigger title and it has its own little title too. When you have analytics, they do take their call number from the larger title along with numbering indicating their position. Now, sometimes you have things that are part of something else and they are not classed together. So they do not sit together on the shelf. And if you have that situation, really the series authority record is what tells you what situation you have. But if you have that situation, then you just classify on following regular rules and just really don't pay too much attention to the series because you don't really need to, since you're not going to put them together on the shelf. But if you do have one that you need to put it together on the shelf, then that series authority record will give you the information you need in terms of that. Serials are classed by subject and they're shelf listed by title. So if you need to actually shelf list them, they're almost always shelf listed by title. And the reason why that is sort of wouldn't say a universal truth, but something that happens regularly, that you shelf list by the title, you cutter by the title, is that there's not typically an author of a journal or a newspaper or a magazine. I mean, you'll have an editor and things like that, but editors come and go and the magazine stays the same, right? Or the newspaper has been around, well, these days, not hundreds of years anymore, but you have a newspaper that's been around for, a couple of 100 years and it's had numerous editors and publishers and all kinds of other people that have been involved in it, but it's still the same newspaper. So serials classed by subject, shelf list by title, generally use no date in the call number. There are a few exceptions to that, but not very many. And for a serial which changes title but stays the same, so like your local newspaper, hometown newspaper may have changed names 10 or 15 or maybe even more times over the years, but it's still the same newspaper. And so the call number stays the same even though there are different titles associated with it. Then you have serials that are somehow related to each other, and these can be things that say supplements or index or parts or somehow are related to each other, and those will use the same call number but use enumeration in some way to say, or a date or some other designator to avoid a call number conflict. So you want to say they're not the same as this title, but they're related. And then finally, for serials, if you have two different serials which would otherwise have the same call number, so they are not, it's not your hometown newspaper where the title just changed, over the years or something. These are actually maybe two competing newspapers in your hometown that have very similar titles. And so they would have the same call number, but they're different newspapers, different visions of newspapers and news and stuff like that. So what you would do in that case is shelf list the one that would sit further alphabetically one more digit out. So if you had something like serial solutions and serials titles where they're going to have the same, uh, it's the same subject, they're going to have that same call number, and then they're going to have the same cutter, you just go out one more for the one that should sit over. So serial titles should come after serial solution alphabetically. So for serial titles, just go out um, one more position. So you would have S and then ER for the serial solution. And then for your serial titles, you would be S and then ERI would go out one digit, and that would have it sit where it needs to sit. Talked a little bit about supplement and indexes. You do not add a date to the call number after those designations. So those go at the end. So we have here, our call number, whatever it is, C64 1977, we have supplement. So supplement goes at the end. Index goes at the end when you have those. I talked a little bit about analytics already. We're going to look at just a couple of examples of these. When you have an analytic, each title is cataloged and the larger title is also cataloged. So for each analytic, you have that larger title for which it's part of, and then each volume that you own of that larger title is cataloged. Individual volumes take the call number of the parent plus the numbering, and that series authority record can really help you to code these. This is what you might see if you are looking at something in OCLC. And anytime you look in OCLC and you see something that has volume numbering in the call number, that is a heads up to consider what you have. In this case, if we were to scroll down the record, we would see that there is an 830, and we could actually, this 830 is hot linked, and so we could actually click on that, and it would take us over to the series authority record, which would tell us FTC. C means class together as a collection. So what does it mean when it's class together as a collection? Well, we know when we class things together, we're looking at how they sit on the shelf, right? So if we class as a collection, we class together. So what does that mean? That means everything that is part of the James Sprint historical studies has the same call number, class together as a collection. So how do you then separate them? Well, we're going to use volume numbering. And so the other thing the series authority record tells us, if you look up here, we have a call number here. So for example, in any work we get, we are going to use for this particular parent title for all the little babies underneath, including the one we have, we're going to use F251.J28. And then we are going to look at our 642 here, and that's going to give us an example of how we should write our call number in terms of our enumeration. So we have our call number F251.J28, and then we have a pattern for how we're going to write our call number and write our enumeration, and then we have down here that it's classed together. So if we go back here and we look, sure enough, look at that. F251.J28, we had volume 20. So we're taking our pattern here in the 642, volume 19, comma, number 1. We are following that exactly with what we're doing. But we have volume 20, so we're going to use what we have. So as we wrap up here, follow the hierarchy when you're looking through the classification tables and looking through the classification schedules. Make sure to follow the hierarchy. Check your tables, so make sure to follow instructions. If you are using the print PDFs, I would say look at your tables first and look at that introductory material that goes with your particular class area before you actually dig in, because you want to make sure you have a sense of what you should do when you get to your tables, because the PDF will not have quite as much instruction as Class Web will. It's always okay to look in OCL to see what other people have done, and certainly it can be a good learning tool, and you may find that you may look for other, like a different edition, and you may look and see like, oh wow, they really messed up on that one, didn't they? So you may look and see, and sometimes you'll find out that people make mistakes, especially with things like the translation that we've just talked about. A translation is one that frequently gets missed, and then those conferences is one that gets missed quite a bit. Do you make sure that when you're shelf listing that you have a unique call number, that you create something that's unique? And we've talked about when you should have call numbers that are the same. So we've talked about these situations like your additions should sit near the original but only be separated by date. Your translations should have that translation number to that translation cutter so that they sit next to the originals, when you should have that kind of thing. And always, always, I hope you get a sense of how important it is to really look at those instructions and to interpret them. Really just follow exactly what they say, because the instructions will tell you what to do. Even if it just seems like, it's like, well, I'm not really sure. Just break the instructions down. If it, just as we did tonight, if it means that you need to take each piece of the instruction and figure it out, go ahead and do that. We already talked about call number conflicts, so we're not going to talk about those again. And on that note, thank you so much for participating in Library and Congress classification, and we will finish up with this class and be catching up through our discussions and our announcements areas. Thank you so much for being part of this class, and I've enjoyed the discussion so far, and please do continue on growing your skills in Library of Congress classification. Thank you.